Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're talking about the 2023 Global Benchmark Report that TKM and We Are MNet have completed. And today we have a panel with Kelly from N26, Marcelo with Edisen. I'm representing We Are MNet, and we have Anil with TKM. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to talk about the benchmark report. This is the industry standard report. As you can see from the results, the roles of participants vary greatly, very senior and across different roles in marketing and brands. And we're finding these folks are primarily in-house or external agencies. In today's session, we'll be covering all these topics. We'll be talking about the maturity of the offshore market, which locations are most attractive and why, primary reasons to offshore, which services are most suited to being offshored, expectations around cost savings, assessment criteria when selecting an offshore partner, onboarding factors and success measurements, technology and automation, as well as challenges and trends. I'm going to now hand it over to Anil, who's going to talk about the results from this survey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steph. And hi, Kelly, Marcelo. Great to have you join us today. Yeah, very excited about the opportunity to sort of share the results. This is our fourth year, as Steph mentioned, producing the benchmark report for offshore creative production. And it was a combination of both quantitative and qualitative analysis this year to ensure that we captured the richest insights possible for our audience. Just a little bit of background to myself and why I'm sort of semi-qualified to be on the panel today. So I was involved with offshore production from 2003 and set up one of the first studios out in Chennai, India, under the guise of Project Lotus. This was basically building creative production capability over what was desktop publishing at the time. And then Chennai in particular, which is in Southeast India, started to develop a very large talent pool. We Are MNet are there today. You've got companies like Hogarth and Tag there, Sun Branding Solutions, R.R. Donnelly. So a rich talent pool was created, and it all kicked off around 2002, 2003. And fundamentally, the primary reason for offshoring at the time, and we're going to dig into this a little bit later, was around cost reduction, and that's still the case today. But 20 years on, the world has changed dramatically, and offshore production has generated a level of maturity now. It's very omni-channel. All the production studios around the world offer everything from digital and social to CGI, video post-production, transcreation, and even things like accessibility. And there was an epiphany moment for me that I always think back to, which actually came in 2010. So I've been working in the world of offshore for some time at this point, and I was running a procurement tender with Lloyd's Banking Group. In the banking sector, it's great to have Kelly on the call today because obviously she's representing the finance sector. The banking sector always sort of promoted this world of offshore. But in 2010, during this procurement tender, we were evaluating two different vendors, two agencies. And it became apparent during that analysis that a lot of the work was being done offshore, and the marketing teams weren't wholly aware of this. And it was interesting because the marketing director sort of stopped us during the course of our findings and said, well, is the quality as we would expect? And the answer was yes. Are we on budget? Yes. Are the service levels being hit? The answer was yes. Communication was sound, and they were getting a fantastic return on investment. And it was at that point the marketing director said, well, in that case, it's sort of irrelevant where the work's being done. Let's just press on. And that was the moment for me where I realized we were reaching a level of sort of semi-maturity around offshore production. So let's look at some of the results of the survey as they stand today. So how mature is the market? Well, 60% of companies that currently offshore, 60% of companies, sorry, that were analysed are offshoring creative production and post-production. 55% of companies that don't currently offshore will definitely be offshoring in the next 12 months. And I think there was another 25% that said that they were certainly considering offshore. And 49% of companies have said they have had an offshore partner for at least 4 years. So the offshore creative production landscape has effectively moved from a emerging stage, where it was in sort of 2010, 2012, to growth in the last 8 or 9 years to now mature in the 2020s. And having multiple partners also is no longer an uncommon practice. So just over 1 in 2 companies have one offshore partner, but 47% of companies actually have 2 partners or more. And the reason for that is primarily down to the diversity of the complex service offering. Some studios are maybe better suited to video post-production and digital. Others may be offering packaging and retail. Also, having multiple studios allows you, of course, to provide extra scale in a short period of time. It mitigates any risk associated with continuity of supply. I think COVID illustrated the importance of that. And then obviously the fact we're into always on campaigns with social campaigns sort of hitting our mobile phones. So having multiple studios allows us to arguably follow the sun. And in some cases, 12% of companies actually have up to 5 offshore partners, which is quite extensive. In terms of actually what's being offshored, the value, well, 68% of companies, so 2 out of every 3, manage at least 10% of their creative production offshore, and 1 in 2 are now managing 20% of their creative production offshore. So on a 5 million production spend, about 1 million of that will be done offshore across the companies that we analysed. And I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll probably see that actually escalate to 30% and beyond. So looking at the actual production models, we asked the question of our participants what production models they saw having the greatest level of investment in 2023. And for the first time in my career, what was really interesting is that actually offshore creative production was seen to potentially have the greatest level of investment going into 2023. You know, networked agencies and independent agencies like Marcelo's at Edisen have always obviously had, you know, prime place. In-house agencies started to develop around 10 years ago and have reached probably a period of maturity. I would imagine the next couple of years, certainly post-COVID and the amount of content that's being created, offshore is going to be the area where we're going to see large levels of investment and spend. So economic uncertainty is definitely driving that investment in offshore, as well as the function around marketing operations departments that are looking to optimize marketing processes, they're looking to drive efficiency and best practice. And they definitely see offshore production as a crucial ingredient to managing content at scale. So there's a number of factors now at play that are ensuring offshore production is becoming an important part of the ecosystem as independent agencies, networks, and the in-house teams. One of the individuals we interviewed, Nikki Russell, some of you may know her, she chaired Creative Operations London this year. She talks about offshore production as perhaps having to move now from a financial and procurement perspective to actually being seen as part of the production strategy, the thing that will allow you to deliver volume and content at scale. So it's a crucial element of the delivery system now in most organizations. So when we look at offshore, which locations are we seeing as being the most attractive? I'm looking forward to Kelly and Marcelo's thoughts on this as well, because I know they probably have different experiences. What came back in terms of our survey was India's ranked #1, and it has been for a number of years and will probably continue to be #1, I would imagine, for the next 10 years. It's an opinion, of course, but it's down to the fact that it's got a very large talent pool. The time zone advantages, of course, allow you to service both UK, Europe, and North America. And there's a lot of support from the higher education institutions to ensure that talent pool continues to sort of develop. Perhaps slightly surprisingly, Colombia came second, but then when we look at the size of their creative economy, what they call the orange economy, worth 10.8 billion, perhaps it's not so surprising that actually they've got a huge talent pool as well that companies are now starting to invest in. And then other companies that fared well were Costa Rica with San Jose primarily. It's ranked #1 for digital skills in LATAM. And then Mexico, which with India is probably the most mature of markets and is still the top exporter of creative assets in Latin America, especially around audio and visual production. Costa Rica, incidentally, very strong on web development. Now, if this had been just a European survey, I think The Philippines, Vietnam, and South Africa also would have fared extremely well. But because we were looking at North America as well, they sort of rely heavily on Central American offshore studios. So that's why I think the results are a little bit skewed in that way, because it's more global. I'm going to hand over to Steph for the first round of questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Anil. And like you said, we'd love to start off hearing from both you, Kelly and Marcelo. Where are you spending your offshore partnership spends, and why those locations? Kelly, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Steph and Anil, and Marcelo, for having me here today. Interestingly enough, back to Anil's point, for us, it would be South Africa, very much due to time zone, which is, of course, perfect for Europe. I'm based in Berlin. So time zone, definitely. Also, just in terms of I'm now very focused on the European market. And in terms of talent, if you're actually creating assets doing a shoot, you can get very easily to get European talent there. A lot of European models go out there for winter. So for us, that's very, very easy to arrange. And in terms of percentage of budget, of the creation budget, not of the activation budget, I would say for us it would be easily 30 to 40% of our budget would be spent on offshoring in the last year.
Are you seeing that as a growth over previous years? Are you continuing to put more offshore, or is that pretty standard year over year?
No, I would say that's slightly increased year on year, and I would say that I would see that increasing in the next year. Yeah, definitely. I would definitely see that, and very much then creating frameworks that then come into creative automation systems that allow us to take the next step of localization and creation in-house.
Excellent, thanks. Marcelo, I'll tee it over to you. Which locations are preferred for Edisen?
Well, I think for me, hello everybody, and I guess good morning for me, and probably good afternoon for most of you. Maybe not Stephanie, but it's funny. I've kind of I'm a little bit of a throwback here. I've been using offshoring in the film and entertainment side of the industry, specifically in the video post-production, for many, many years, and a lot of that was kind of was really pioneering in India. At one point I had a company where we did 2D to 3D conversion for film, and we had 1,500 people in Pune, India. So I think India is a very comfortable location for me, and I think the maturity on the marketing side is coming from the rich history already in video moving, or film and television moving. So it's a natural progression. So I am slightly biased here. I would say that even coming from the US, India has always been a reliable resource. It's not only from a talent perspective and creative perspective, but in a, coming from the US and needing, essentially what I call a 24/7 workflow, India has always been very kind of progressive and understanding and aware of that. Although coming from the Americas, on the marketing side, we tend to also, I would say, smart shore or creatively shore into the Americas, and going into the obvious places like Mexico, and Colombia is now, especially on the video side, moving forward. Digital has always been really strong there. But I would have to say my first instinct is India first, and then from there try and find alternative partners.
Marcelo, is all your work done in India today, or is some percentage being done in the LATAM locations?
I would say probably for the work that we do outside of our own network of the resources that we have on staff, I would say probably 80% of it goes to India in some capacity, whether it's feature film, television, marketing services, and digital. Ideally, I see a world, a utopian world for me where 90+% of that goes there for those types of services and needs. And kind of creative ideation and oversight would come from the key markets from a sale perspective and from a creative sale perspective, and then using those resources. So that's where I would lean to.
Excellent. And then what % of your total production marketing budget goes to offshore today?
I would say, probably, if I had to guess, it's probably in the 20 to 30%. And that's across, multiple mediums, but that's a conservative number and growing.
Excellent. Thanks. Anil, any queries from your side, or you want to keep going?
Yeah, no, I'll keep going, but it's great just to sort of have two pioneers in the room, sort of talking about this, reinforcing, I suppose, the percentages and actually showing what's possible in terms of, as Kelly said, 30 to 40%, and Marcelo with having done work in India for so many years, it's sort of reinforcing the hunches that these surveys often sort of throw up. So that's really positive to hear, and hopefully next year we'll see those numbers actually increase as well amongst the wider audience. So we're going to just move into primary reasons to offshore, and actually Kelly's already sort of touched on this around talent and resource, and Marcelo also. 1,500 people in Pune. I mean, that's staggering to hear and wonderful to hear, in terms of what's possible. So primary reasons to offshore. Well, the last 3 or 4 years of the report, it's almost entirely been about resource. I mean, if we look at numbers 2, access to resource that can scale, obviously the amount of content that's being produced at the moment, companies need to have that access to resource or talent that can scale. Access to 24/7 resource, of course, campaigns are always on, and therefore we need to have multiple hubs to sort of facilitate the production of that content as and when it's needed. And we've got a couple of sound bites later on that will talk through that. Access to additional talent and resource, and access to new skills and capabilities. As companies move to a digital first strategy, quite often, if they're moving from the high street to online, they'll need access to skills that they just don't have in their in-house studios, or they don't have the right agencies to facilitate those, especially around digital advertising. So those are areas where resources sort of risen to the top. And then access to flexible resource. I think post-COVID, being able to forecast effectively was extremely difficult. Planning was very challenging. And so the need to be able to access another 20 people to facilitate that asset creation offshore was extremely useful for in-house studios, agencies, and marketeers alike. However, this year, just going back to number 1, it's still about resource, but there's a real emphasis now on low cost. We're all feeling it. The budget squeeze that are potentially happening, or certainly are imminent if they're not happening currently, for organizations means that we're really leaning in now on the low cost models that the resource offshore can provide. It's not that the talent or the production is any worse than what you get in North America or across Europe or in the UK. They're just in low cost economies, so we can really lean in on those cost savings. And 81% of respondents actually have access to low cost resources, the number one reason for offshoring. And just I'm going to talk about savings in a little bit more detail in a few moments, but if we look at the in-house model, typical cost savings are around 20 to 40%. That's bringing skills in-house, either insourcing an agency or actually hiring individuals that are part of your brand to accommodate the shift to digital spend. And obviously with Kelly's company, the digital spend must be entirely digital, I would imagine. So, it accommodates the shift to digital spend, which I would imagine is why Kelly's got 40% being done offshore and a growing team. So typical cost savings of 20 to 40% are across the board. That can be media, it can be creative, it can be production and post-production. Whereas with offshore, the savings are typically higher, but only around a certain number of services. And they are generally tier 3 and sometimes tier 2 services. So less creative, a little bit of leaning into adaptation, and a lot around post-production, which Marcelo's already mentioned. And so the remote working, of course, has accelerated the offshore interest. There's significant cost advantages, but fundamentally, if you can produce a model, an ecosystem that allows you to combine your external agency and your in-house team with a third-party offshore partner or even your own offshore team. That is where the real value lies. And agreeing a strategy that encompasses those three elements is where you'll deliver most value to your business. So which services are most suited to offshoring? Well, before we look at the services that are being managed offshore, we probably should look at where the spend is developing at a campaign level within your own budgets. And as budgets squeeze, digital channels obviously are prioritizing spend, and customer journeys are recalibrating who's going to be a marketeer. You know, it's really challenging now to know what that customer journey really looks like. Hybrid production models are now being adopted at pace. So where the spend is, when we asked this question for our participants, 23% had digital marketing and display advertising, you know, as their biggest area of spend, unsurprisingly. Short form video content, as Marcelo's alluded to already, also a lot high area of spend. Social marketing, number 3, transcreation and localization, number 4, with relevancy and personalization more important than ever. Transcreation has become, you know, something that every organization is looking at. Cultural consistency, translation, transcreation, and then making that content exceptionally relevant for the audience. And then finally, we have CGI. And momentum around CGI, we saw a huge level of momentum building up during COVID. You know, photography studios were being shut down, you know, momentarily, thankfully. But while that was happening, a lot of the CGI was being then done in the offshore hubs, and the skill sets have undoubtedly enhanced in the last 3 years across the offshore studios that I certainly am aware of. So many brands obviously are continuing to build their digital first strategy. They're looking at performance-based marketing, which is based on digital content, inbound, and content marketing. So digital is definitely the area where we see most spend developing. And that's great, because actually in terms of the services most suited to offshore, when the results came back, digital advertising was number 1. Banner ads, whatever type of digital advertising, that was the area where the services on offer, the skills available in the offshore hubs are at a premium. They're very strong in this particular area, from something as simple as a static banner to HTML hand-coded, HTML5 hand-coded animated banners. A lot of production now is around digital, with levels of automation thrown in as well. The more traditional services like retouching and artwork and pre-press, of course, also score highly. High volumes are being done offshore. We're almost getting to a point, and I've got to be careful what I say here, but why would you hire an art worker in the UK or in Europe or North America? At a certain point you would do, but not at volume, when you can actually get those skills offshore. CGI and 3D modeling, again, we just saw CGI as a big area of spend. This also came up as a service that a lot of companies are now looking to offshore, and they believe the offshore market is suitable. Video post-production, still in the top 10, but a little bit lower down than we would have expected, actually, and that could just be down to the survey and the participants. I'd expect that to keep moving up. I think in India, Marcelo's right, it's very strong, the capability, but there are other countries perhaps that don't quite have the same level of video post-production expertise as India and South Africa and Mexico, and that's probably why it's a little bit further down. And then transcreation and localization again was in there, number 5. Presentations and pitch books, interestingly, infographics. There's huge volume of offshore being done around that particular service, but it can be very industry specific. So investment banking, for example, and that's probably why it's a little bit lower down, but the maturity is still fairly solid for that type of service. Questions for the panel? Back to Steph.
Thanks, Anil. So Marcelo and Kelly, I saw you both nodding your head a lot during Anil's point about resourcing during COVID and offshoring. So I'm curious to know from both of you, what are the business drivers for you in looking to offshore work or talent? And did those change or just get exacerbated during COVID? So Marcelo, I'll start with you.
You know, I think I don't know if it's one specific thing that's a driver. I think that it's kind of been part of my, you know, kind of operational viewpoint of how we work and expand. It's interesting to see the statistic around video and post-production kind of being down at the bottom when video is becoming the most critical piece in marketing and advertising. So it's interesting. I think when you run operations in places like North America and Europe and in key markets like the UK, the cost of doing scaled businesses is getting more and more challenging. So having the right resources within these lower cost centers, but high quality output, I think to me, that's the key. And again, India has always been that kind of go-to for me on that. When the question on what services are most suited to offshore, it's interesting because I think in one of the surveys, or one of the things that I read early on when Anil was presenting, the conversation was around having 4 or 5 different partners. I actually look at things as maybe having less, 1 or 2 partners, but that can complete the full circle of services, because as you work closer and closer with marketers, they're needing that full 360 delivery. So it's not just the hero campaign, but all of the elements that come around that hero campaign, all the way down to digital and banners and print, along with transcreation and adaptation for their global clients. So to me, it's narrowing it down from a partner perspective, but having a company that can provide all of those services at the quality that you need.
Great, thanks. Kelly, I'm going to tee same questions over to you. What are your business drivers, and did you see that change at all during COVID?
I think there's quite a few business drivers, just as Marcelo was alluding to, cost is certainly one. Flexibility and team size, right? Mm-hmm. So there'll be 3 times a year that I have a massive need for, an influx of hands. And it doesn't pay for me to hire, full-time employees, to only really have them there when we're ramping up. So also allowing for that economy of scale. And I would say that everything I do is digital, right? Like, we may do a piece of out of home that isn't digital because it isn't available on this the media is not available in those specific locations. But that would be the only piece of non-digital work that we would look at all. And as I had mentioned sort of earlier, we work with a lot of our assets within frameworks. So we have contributed to and continue to contribute with a partner who builds sort of creative automation. So we create within a specific templated format that then allows us to knock out thousands of assets based on code in a minute, which under a minute, which is amazing. With that, we're able to look at the data. So what is actually working on channel, and then bring out, it's not A/B testing anymore, right? It's A to Q testing for numerous different markets. And for us, that allows us to keep creating those overarching brand assets that then we can, bring lower into the funnel for that sort of, lower funnel pieces. So that gives us a lot more control there. When we're talking about the types of services, it can be quite a lot, but funnily enough, the one thing, being a bank, that we cannot do is transcreation and localization offshore. One, because of rules, and we're N26 is a real bank, right? We are no different to Lloyd's. We have we're under BaFin, which is the German banking authority. So with the legal framework that we have to work within, I actually have a team of localization specialists in-house. They are fully aware of the different languages that need to be used in alignment with launching crypto in Austria, right? That is, how you communicate and talk about these new things in the world. When you're a bank, you cannot give advice, but you can educate. And what is the difference between education and advice in Spanish about a German product, right? So the levels of complexity there is next level. So we would do a lot of creation, post, also from stills to moving images would be our main. There would be a bit of creative copywriting. Also because it would be much more English first in South Africa, which could be quite interesting. So sometimes we would have creative copywriting done externally, very much based on our own framework. So we would not have ideation, for instance, because we do have that hybrid model. We have a very, very strong in-house team owning the brand, driving the brand forward, and then working with partners that can just strengthen that team if and when needed.
Interesting. Going back when you mentioned you have transcreation in-house, are those copywriters and designers as well who are centralized localizing everything? Great.
100%. They know the brand. Again, banking language, legal language per market is so different. Especially when you start to think of these up and coming commodities or whatever we would want to call them. And consistency, even though you have the tools, just how you say pin automat is it a bank machine? Is it an ATM? Right? That just consistency across touch points is really, really important.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Actually, you've given me an idea, Kelly. I think maybe going into the end of the year, we'll do a report that's just dedicated to financial services. I think that'd be really interesting because of the nuance you just described there around transcreation. It doesn't, and maybe we're at a point actually, even with Marcelo talking about video post-production, I was also surprised by that particular statistic being lower down, but it'd be interesting to maybe in a subsequent report just dig into why that was a bit lower, because I agree. I think the maturity of video post is there for all to see, and you've obviously been living and breathing it for a number of years, Marcelo. So we should maybe explore that and try and get that insight, because this is a fairly broad report, and maybe we can start to navigate down certain industries and service lines. And I'm probably just making a lot of work for myself, but I feel that would probably be beneficial to the audience. So that's great. And thank you for that. And also creative copywriting, Kelly, you mentioned, that's something that I don't think that was an option, but actually maybe it should be now as a tier 2 type creative services that companies are looking to offshore as well. So we'll definitely include that in the next round of this report. Okay, so expectations around cost savings. All the procurement teams on the call, their ears will pick up, I'm sure, when we start talking about what's possible here. So in some cases, the savings that the participants of the report actually talk about were as high as 80%, especially for digital advertising, digital banners, and also web and app development. And web and app development, we know, it's part of the creative production ecosystem now. But it's very mature offshore. And obviously, if you're working with CMS platforms, e-commerce platforms from Magento to something like Embraco on CMS and PHP and WordPress, these are very large established web and app teams now. So the cost savings can be fairly significant as long as you avoid any scope creep. And then the same on the digital side. But across all service lines, the average typical saving, and we listed quite a few service lines in the report, the average typical saving was around 41%. And that's what organizations can sort of like work towards if they're building a business case for either moving work offshore or looking to bring in a new partner. If we dig a little bit deeper, almost 4 out of every 5 companies are expecting around a 20% or more saving on adaptive design. So that's starting to edge towards that tier 2 world. 2 out of every 3 companies would expect a saving of around 20% or more for presentation, often done at volume. So savings could potentially increase there. And 1 out of every 2 companies would expect a saving around 40% on transcreation localization if it can be done offshore. Video post-production, So again, 4 out of every 5 companies, close to 80%, expect savings of around 40% for video post-production. I mean, I've seen even higher than that. I'm sure Marcelo's got a lot of experience in that area, but I've seen even higher potential savings around video post. And then digital banners, it's around 60% of respondents said around 40% should be saved for digital banners. And then CGI, where maybe there's a bit less talent, but companies, 1 out of every 2 would expect savings of around 40%. So the business case undoubtedly commercially should stack up, and it's becoming extremely competitive offshore. There's an emergence of new territories, new studios developing all the time that are offering their services, and there are definitely deals to be had there, especially if you're looking at volume and content at scale. So how do you assess the criteria when selecting an offshore partner? A few years ago, this was often seen as we'll throw it over the fence. It was very much a supplier-vendor relationship, and I think we're seeing some real changes certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, where it's really partnerships. I mean, Kelly, you're putting 40% of the work or 30% offshore. These are really, this is your studio effectively, to all intents and purposes. So, what are the most important assessment criteria? Well, expertise and capability actually came out as number 1, and it can often be evaluated when you're assessing an offshore team through rigorous pilots, work done in parallel, and a series of tests before you fully engage. They can be done quickly and at a micro level, but it's super important to do that to ensure the expertise you expect from your teams is there. Sometimes companies can make the mistake of not testing rigorously up front, and then it comes back to bite them a little bit later on when the work gets a little bit more challenging. Quality assurance and control was also almost on a par with expertise and capability, and they are of course related. If you have the expertise, the quality should be there, as long as you have a strong quality assurance design program in play. So that's around quality control, brief management. Brand guardianship is super important now when you're working with brands, especially if the brands may not always be centralized, they could be localized, so you're working with multiple territories with slightly differing brand management systems. Quality assurance procedures, quality metrics, you should expect metrics back from your offshore providers, and then quality audits as well. Communication came in at number 3, unsurprisingly again. So, I mean, these are all important. It's very hard to differentiate one from the other, but communication was number 3. And again, this goes beyond just the verbal. We talked there about strong documentation, commercial management and planning, and continuous feedback. There are always going to be teething problems with your offshore partner, as there is with any agency or any studio you work with. They just happen to be in a different country, and therefore on the list there you can see cultural alignment actually came in at number 6. This is going to continue to be more important, that cultural alignment, because the cultural alignment allows you to ensure that the communication, the last mile for quality, are always on point, and then the leaning in on the cultural nuances of what a team desires is really important. And it's almost about having a shared vision as to what both the offshore partner and the in-house studio or the third-party agency expect from you. And there's also something that's the smart shoring model, which is a hybrid model, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, of regional client services and offshore production. So I just want to talk a little bit about culture for a moment. Everyone's seen that quote from Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And before COVID, it was interesting. The number of companies I would talk to who were, it didn't matter how strong the business case was commercially, they were not offshore for a whole host of reasons. They wanted it to be in-house. They didn't feel they had the right level of technology. There was always barriers. There was cultural barriers. And that's where culture eats strategy for breakfast, because the commercial business case would always win until culture took over, and then it would never be successful. But in a post-COVID world, those barriers and this need to work remotely took over, and suddenly we've seen this huge acceleration in offshore production as a result of that. The cultural barriers have disappeared. Everyone works remotely or is used to working remotely, and they have the technology in place now to be able to facilitate and enable that. So offshore production has become accessible, it's become practical, it's become commercially effective. And I would argue now it's a strategic imperative for most companies. And just going back to that cultural alignment and what smart shoring is, and Marcelo mentioned the word smart shoring earlier. So smart shoring is a model that we're seeing being adopted, which really promotes cultural alignment, where you have offshore, it's fundamentally the use of the best talent wherever they are in the world. So you have offshore production studios to ensure that you're maximizing the low cost economies available to you. And then you have client service teams in region to ensure that cultural alignment that's becoming so important for when you're producing content at scale. And that's a model that, you know, is something, and there's various types of offshore models, but smart shoring is one that we're seeing more is becoming more relevant. I'll hand over back to Steph.
Thanks, Anil. Kelly, I'll start with you. What type of savings, percentage of savings, did you expect when moving offshore, and what are you currently receiving versus onshore costs?
I think when we started this, I mean, when I started doing this, goodness, I'm too long in the business. I'm showing my age. I would say at least 15 years ago, we would have started offshoring. I think then expectation, you know, was 15%. I was looking at a tender we were doing just for our last campaign, just before we came on, just so I could refresh some of my numbers. And it was it's sort of a twofold sort of response. So we had a 35% saving on cost overall, but we had a 25% increase in output. So I was able to create more and for a lot less. So on kind of both sides. So we will always look to we have to look at, you know, being a bank again, right? I need to have 5 approaches to sort of everything that we do, and it's not necessarily the most cost efficient that we go for. It's the one that sort of fits the brand best, timelines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we always look at offshoring. We look at different partners also within Europe. So yeah, we with the partners within Europe, they wouldn't even accept the brief for the budget. Like 2 people wouldn't even, 2 businesses wouldn't even quote for it. They said no.
And as your 25% output, is that a result of the automation partner you're using, or is it?
No, this was just so partners in Europe wouldn't even look at it. We wanted a certain number of assets created, but actually, when we went to create them with our offshore partner, they were able to create 20. They then looked at what we were creating and thought, let's create 25% more within the budget.
Amazing.
So, and I was like, thank you. Right. So yeah, we were able to do like some shorter edits. We were asking for some bonus material, sort of, if we could. So be, you know, like a B crew, and yeah, that was all. We were all able to get a lot of that into the overall budget, which we had expected an increase of cost, but that was not the case.
That's amazing.
So it was a double whammy, and quality was phenomenal. So super happy.
And then teeing off of that, what is your assessment? What criteria are you testing, vetting partners on when choosing them? So it sounds like in this scenario, you had a robust brief where it was more deliverables, less money. You know, I'm assuming, as you mentioned, cost is always a factor. But what other in the process are you doing tests? Are you vetting other things? What is your criteria?
Rigorous testing. My ECD is, I've worked with ECDs with the eye for detail in the past, but my current ECD is phenomenal, a crazy eye. So quality is certainly number one. A lot of the things that we do have to, you know, they're around product launches. So it's also time, right? Because I can't launch a product if I don't have a marketing campaign. So that plays a big factor, right? Whether they can actually deliver everything that we want within generally the pretty short timelines that I'm given, right? Because product are building to a sprint. And it's only a couple of sprints before we release that, you know, that I'm given the go ahead. So that's a huge part of it. Flexibility because of that, right? Because then maybe they're building at that moment, which isn't, it's not working, it's not going according to plan. Or, within being heavily regulated industry, a lot of our products have to be tested, right, by the powers that be. And whether that is, the German banking authority, Spanish banking authority, etc., there can be holdups there as well. So it's about having those flexibilities and being able to change and adapt things at the last minute. But we test rigorously before we onboard an additional offshore third party. And for us as well, once that relationship is built and it's built on trust, very much like Marcelo, we go back time and time again. Mm-hmm. Because when you get an offshore partner that understands your brand, that understands your way of working, within a heavily regulated industry, and also for us, right? Like if we want to onboard them to our tools, that's also, in a heavily regulated, I don't want to keep repeating, but yes, banking is a heavily regulated industry. So even just to get them onto our project management tools, to get them, into the same things, takes a huge amount of effort from an operational standpoint. So once you do that, it's not to say that if they weren't doing what they had agreed to do, that we wouldn't go try and find somebody else. Of course we would. But you work harder to make that relationship work when you do have these obstacles.
Excellent. Thank you. Marcelo, I'll tee it over to you. We'll start with cost savings that you were expecting and what you're currently seeing. And then how are you assessing your offshore partners?
Yes, I think from the savings, it's interesting. I was looking at all of those numbers, and I guess there is a kind of a common theme. I think, at a minimum of a 20% for me, as a whole to get started. And some of this comes from, as I think Anil mentioned earlier, budgets are getting more and more restricted, but still need to deliver the quality or the output that the clients are expecting. So for us, at a minimum of 20%, which immediately gives us the flexibility to look at potential creative projects that we wouldn't be able to handle internally. So having the right strategic partner creatively to deliver the 20% is a key starter for us. And then anything above that within the work frame that we're doing is obviously a benefit for us and deliver back to the client, potentially. So that's a standard, and I guess that seems to be a flatline number as a minimum. I think the criteria for me, it's interesting in selecting, I think, and looking at, I think the feedback that Anil talked about, I think maybe number one was quality, and then I think communication was the third. Yeah, it was interesting, and I was looking at that. For me, in my experience, or in kind of my operational leadership around this, finding the partner, I think quality and all of those things are a given and a standard, right? I think that's if you don't have that confidence in, or the ability to actually deliver all of those things, there's never really the conversation. For me, 3, which was communication, is about the relationships with the people that are kind of heading up, or at least the partnership people that you're working with. The way I look at smart shoring and offshoring is it's not transactional for me, it's relationship based. And so if we have those right relationships, and I can rely on that person or that team of people that are confident in what they can deliver, that's really key and paramount for me. That's the first part of it. So if I know that I can, I look at myself, talking, listening and laughing when Kelly said she was dating herself in this industry. I think the same for me. I mean, I'm in year 40 now in producing what we now call content. So it's been quite some time. And it's always been about the relationship of the people that are involved with this. I have to have, obviously, the trust and the expertise is a given, but start with that. And then the rest of those things, I believe, have to be paramount to what they do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having that conversation. So I look at this maybe three 1, 2 in how we look at that. And so that's a big part of it. And obviously cost savings is critical. But like I said, this isn't just a transactional relationship for me. It's a more partnership relationship, which is a bit something that I look at this from offshoring in a different perspective.
Yeah. So it sounds like from both of you, everything listed here, like these are the basics. You got to be delivering on this. But the thing that's going to set you apart is that trust, is that relationship, who's answering the phone when you're talking big or small. So that's really interesting. All right. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, and Kelly mentioned turnaround times as well, which critical assessment factor and during the pilots and the rigorous testing, obviously, that you do at the bank. I'm sure the turnaround times are a crucial factor. And actually, you both mentioned the word trust, and when we get onto the I think the last 2 sections of today, onboarding an offshore partner. Number 1 actually was structured communication, planning and regular reviews. And I think that really contributes to building trust. Just having that communication channel open, and those first days in any campaign, any project are so crucial, and the regularity of those reviews, ensuring that that the communication channels are always open. It scored highest here, 65% of participants selected structured communication and regular reviews in their top 3. And I think that is actually really what builds trust and allows us to have continuous feedback and improvement. Implementing rigorous SLAs, as Marcelo said, it's a hygiene factor, QA. There is no relationship without that. And it's almost a given. It's almost like we can take those out now going forward and have a caveat at the top that says, we know QA is super important. What about everything else? I think one thing that threw up a very interesting stat for me was visiting the offshore studio and meeting in person before COVID. Obviously, we were seeing a lot of this. And from my own personal experience, from 2020 to 2022, it all stopped. And then towards the end of last year, we started to see more studio visits. But this year, I'm seeing and hearing a lot of travel happening. In-house studios and third-party agencies are going to visit their offshore studios, wherever they may be, to build that, to accelerate that trust, actually, and ensure that they can meet the teams and physically see what the capability looks like, what the processes look like, and ensure that the output is where it needs to be. So I wasn't surprised to see that actually go up the list, and it was quite gratifying to sort of see that happening. And then again, the in-country client services and offshore production hubs, that is the smart shoring model. So that in itself has also moved up the scale to now be in the top 5, which I thought was interesting, because it may increase cultural nuance, definitely, and there could be some cost implications, but it's certainly helping with the output. And then how do you measure success? Well, here we go. So at the end of the day, the quality of the work has to be as expected, and that comes out at number 1. And then number 2, commercial ROI. So nothing groundbreaking here, but just reinforcing the fact that those are ultimately the 2 most important. It's great that you both mentioned trust now, because number 3 is forming trusted relationships. And if you take those top 3, you can probably build your entire business case and long-term partnership with them. Work done to deadlines, as Kelly said, the amount of content being produced now, every team I know is under pressure to deliver to deadline. It's extremely challenging. And if you've got trust in a partnership, that work can be done to deadline. And I think that's probably where India, can also support North American companies because the time zones are so extensive, and you buy yourself back a few hours. And then one thing that I thought was interesting was developing commercial opportunities together. So that really has moved now to a partnership where companies are going to be pitching together. Maybe they'd be white labeled under the in-house studio or under the agency name, but actually developing opportunities together for the benefit of all. I thought it was fascinating to see that, because that shows a true partnership. And then investing in technology and automation, which we're going to come on to in a moment, also got into the top 10. So what technology should your offshore partner provide? Now, again, we could probably do a whole, and we probably will do a whole webinar on this, but we've only got 1 slide on this because of time. But number 1 was actually project management. Not surprising, you know, if you have an offshore partner, they either need to use your project management solution or have their own. You need to see transparency of every campaign, every project, every job that's going through the business. Studio resource management actually came second, and that I thought was an interesting one. You know, as companies are now building teams of 20, 30, 50, 100 people offshore, and these are often full-time employees, understanding the capacity and the utilization of those teams is actually extremely important. And the studio resource management gives you that visibility, and then you can flex those teams up and down on an annual basis. If you need more people because the capacity is at 95%, utilization is at 95%, then you can flex your team. But if they're underutilized, studio resource management allows you that visibility, and then you can change your structure accordingly with the offshore partner. Automation, unsurprisingly, has moved up the rankings to 3rd this year. It's great. Kelly, I'd love to speak to you more about what you guys are doing, because you're obviously leading the line here. But we're seeing a lot more companies move towards automation. They probably aren't doing it as much as they would like, and because they maybe haven't started off with a digital mindset in the way that your business has. But automation, I think, for digital, for video post-production, even for packaging, is now becoming a little bit more commonplace, and the offshore teams need to sort of provide those solutions. Digital asset management squeezed in at number 7, I think, because it's just a hygiene factor now. If you haven't got a dam, if your agency doesn't provide a dam, if the in-house team hasn't got a dam, or your offshore partner doesn't have a dam, you should definitely get one and put that on your agenda for this year. Back to Steph.
Excellent. Thanks, Anil. So this is our final interrogation. So, so thank you all. Love to know from both of you, Marcelo, I'll start with you. What is your process for onboarding a new studio? Do you visit the locations? Do you put out an RFP? You know, how do you source a new partner?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it's interesting because for us, in so many cases, it's been creatively led, you know, for the type of works that we do. And so we try and find the right relationships that have at least an appreciation or understanding for what we do. You know, traveling to new studios has always been a critical, and the last few years has been more challenging. I think that's beginning again. I find myself, you know, finding relationships and, you know, or outreach from people in LATAM and South America. So that's definitely becoming more and more part of the process for us. And then the next piece is connecting our internal workflow leaders and quality assurance team within those other teams. And so that there is a familiarity with workflow, how we particularly work, how we deliver, the type of tools that we use within our workflows, because that's critical, especially on the video side. So there's multiple things, but I think the visiting the locations is something that's starting to kind of really kind of ramp back up again, and taking a big part in that. You know, from a technology perspective, it's funny, looking at DAM as the lowest, I continue to be the contrarian in this conversation, because every time I look at it and I go to the lowest one and I say, actually, that's a critical piece for me. I think actually, you know, digital asset management is critical. And I think that there's a underestimated value in how important that piece is to what everyone is doing and where your assets are, the repurposing of assets, you know, and the longer tail value of what those assets are. So that's a big part of it for me. And then, you know, then, like I said, the other technology parts of that are especially on the video side, that similar work, the tools that we use in the similar workflows are critically important to what we're doing, so that is a seamless transition from our creatives into the partner and then back into our creatives for delivery. So that's always critical. But I leave that to the more suited members of my team to focus on that and make that decision.
Excellent. And then one last trick question, not listed here. How would you measure success? How do you know you got the right partner?
You're asking that to me, Steph?
You, Marcel, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, it's when my teams and my colleagues that are using the partnerships that have been developed are just out of instinct rolling into those relationships and relying on them to deliver what they're doing. So it becomes an extension of their kind of creative output, right? As opposed to, hey, we're stuck in this problem. How do we get this thing delivered? We need to focus on cost, but we still want to deliver quality. Who do we go to? So to me, that's a big benchmark, right? So if they're automatically becoming part of the ecosystem of what we're doing, to me, that's a big part of it. And then you know that what you're trying to get accomplished has been accomplished.
Excellent. Thank you. Hey, Kelly. Let's chat a little bit about what is your onboarding process. I know you spoke at length about testing, and regulations, but yeah, how do you choose? Clearly getting European agencies to talk to you is a little bit rough, but vetting the office.
The European agencies will talk to you, but it's when they start seeing your budget, they're like, "Hey, we want to work with you, but we'll just do half of the brief." Which is, yeah, it's generally that's not allowed, of course. I think onboarding, it's really a perfect mix of your partner understanding your brand, right? Because if they understand your brand and drink the Kool-Aid, right, they're going to deliver against that quality, right? I think that's first and foremost. And then I think also mixed with your last trick question, how do you measure success? Because everything we do is digital, I have cost per result of every asset that has ever flown, right? So when you start to work with the amazing people that I work with, who can then build a data model, right, that I can then easily weave into a business case to say, to acquire X amount of customers in this touch point, will cost Y amount of money. Then I know which cost per result I can look at. Then I can, really identify how much I can be spending. And these partners understand that as well. So it's that perfect mix of quality, of understanding the brand, and then also being able to deliver volume at low cost. It's not, because it's not all down to that cost piece, right? Like, yes, there's a huge cost factor, but yeah, so it's bringing a model of those sort of three things together. Cost per result does drive a lot, especially when you're looking at lower funnel, but you need to look at those longer term brand metrics as well. So how are you looking at those? What value do you give to that? And therefore, how much investment are you going to put in any sort of given, whether it is a campaign versus a program, right? As well, sort of depending on the language that you use. And I must say, quite interesting, which I didn't hear anybody say why they were going to a location. And it was inspiration. Like, whenever we get our teams to go and meet our third-party suppliers and inspire them, right? And really bring them on, make them feel, again, like Marcelo had said, right? It's an extension of your team. It has to be, which is built on trust, because there's so much that you're putting into their hands. To go there to do, to onboard them to the brand, to get them to understand, even if they're not writing for you, they still need to understand your tone of voice, because that's how you speak, therefore how you are seen, right? So really doing these inspiration sessions with them to bring them closer, so that they feel responsible for the assets that they're sending back.
That's
because
huge.
it feels like it's their job.
Well said.
Yeah, well said.
Well said.
Excellent. And then just the last piece, you mentioned a few technologies earlier. What are the drivers for the majority of your offshoring that you leverage?
That we drive. So as being a bank, I cannot log on to somebody else's, certainly not on this laptop, right? I'm not allowed to log on to somebody else's software, because goodness knows what could happen to our technology. So we work within a very, very closed system. So we would then drive the technology decisions for our external partners.
And it's
Just to
mostly
make
workflow, dams, those sorts of things like that, all production related tools.
yeah, yeah, owned by us, driven by us, decisions made by us, and to make sure that, you know, if anything even holds any form of PII, right? Europe is a different kettle of fish with GDPR, etc. And then being a bank within Europe is just another level of security that that drives it. So we're super on that to make sure that that we're all within the sort of gated systems and closed systems, and we are able to track who logs on from where to do what. We can build closed areas for teams to be working on when we know they're working with an offshore partner. So we can really then restrict the data that is given and the information flow there.
Excellent.
Excellent. I think that specific report just on finance is sort of building momentum as we speak. I know we're almost on time, so I'm going to just rattle through the last. I just wanted to quickly just share a little bit of the insight as well from some of the individuals who we interviewed during this piece of insight. Marie Philemon, Director of Creative Operations at Norwegian Cruise Line based out in Florida. She talked about the biggest challenge for brands being in planning this year. So the original piece of creative gets done, and then there's a sudden push to create hundreds of assets. I was keen just to mention this because Kelly, you talked about this right at the beginning, hundreds of assets suddenly at launch time. How do we do it? We've got deadlines to meet. We need skills and services, and that's where the offshore teams can really support. Nikki Russell, who we quoted earlier, she again talked about vast amounts of content, but to actually see offshore production as part of the overall production strategy and start bringing creative and production strategy closer together rather than just seeing production as part of the delivery system. So I thought it was fascinating. We've got Ezio Sapinari, who's the head of creative and production at one of the largest global consumer brands in the world. He talked about, again, quantity of content. He talks about reducing waste. So sustainability started to come up as an element in this report for the first time. You know, how do we connect better inside and ensure that we're reducing our waste, CO2 footprint, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion in the production model. And then he also talks about measurement, and there's more about this in the report. And then finally, Marcelo, who is we've got him both to speak at this event, so thank you for that, and also contributed to the actual report. Marcelo talks about centralizing the volume execution, potentially offshore. So do your creative in LA or New York or Amsterdam or Berlin, but centralize your volume into an offshore hub, which allows you to really drive your cost effectiveness. And I think, yeah, one final thought for me, which is, 60% of all companies are utilizing offshore production. A further 55% of those that don't currently offshore will be doing in the next 12 months. So it's unsurprising, I think, now that offshore creative production, for the moment, is superseding other production models in terms of investment. And we'll see this grow in the next couple of years. Back to Steph.
Excellent. Well, many thanks, Kelly and Marcelo, for sharing your expertise and great insight into this topic. I hope this was an enjoyable webinar for everyone joining us. And please feel free to click the QR code to download the copy of the benchmark report or reach out at any time for more information on offshoring. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.